Hey, Nate, it's time to catch up.
Hey, Mason, it's that time again. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, listeners. Excited to catch up with you today.
Likewise, today we're covering a ton of really interesting and semi-related themes. What are you going to be talking about?
Right. All our themes sort of connect together, but today we're thinking a lot about the demand side of learning innovation. We're thinking about learning spaces and alternative learning spaces and what does that look like in communities. We do a little riff on micro-credentialing in New Zealand because it's good for us to travel abroad. And then we do a little bit of thinking about AI assisted teams, continuing on our talk about AI agents from last time and some interesting research that just came up. So, what else do you want to add?
Yeah, we also talk about how to audit if your place is ready for AI assisted teams and other AI tools, as well as returns on innovative investments. And we also ask some questions about, is abundance possible without a lifelong learning infrastructure? And as technology adopters, what can we in our school systems learn from the Amish? So it's
Awesome.
going to be a great conversation. Let's
Yeah,
jump in.
let's go.
Uh,
I'm catching up, but I'm falling behind. This road is long and these hills sure ain't kind. Every step forward feels like two steps back. I'm catching up, but I'm losing the track.
All right, well, let's talk. What's going on in your world? What are the things that surprised you? What do you see this week?
I've been at a lot of conferences this week, so I've seen a number of things. I think something that struck me this week is that we kind of need a new term for missing information rather than misinformation. I think they both exist and they're both problems, but there's this thing that happens where, for example, I was in a room, I was at the COSIN conference, which was up in Seattle, and we were in a room talking about FERPA, and the person was doing a presentation and was like, let's do a quiz on FERPA. Everybody in this room must know FERPA pretty well because they're like the district liaison for FERPA. And we got 2 out of 5 right as a collective in the room. And everybody was very confident in their answers. So there's like this weird thing where there's a bunch of gaps, I guess. And as we go into this AI world, I think everything's going to get accused of misinformation. But there's actually this other spot where people just like are sort of making a hunch off of something that they have, and then it eventually just like cements. And I think that can be a cause of misinformation, like a few degrees out. But internally, I think it's just missing information.
We're doing a presentation at the air show in San Diego this weekend on Sunday, and it's about media literacy and doing it with Reedy over at Ed3DAO. And so this will be in the past for those who are listening. But the concept is about media literacy in the age of AI. And it does make me think is that we're talking a lot about misinformation and disinformation, but almost it's the abundance of information going on your theme from last time. This abundance of information causes us to only have a few puzzle pieces in the puzzle at any
Yeah,
one time. I mean, it's almost impossible to keep up no matter
totally.
who you are in whatever profession because of the volumes coming through. So I like that. We have a third piece here or second piece that's parallel to misinformation. So it's not all devious. Some of it's just you just can't keep up and understand everything.
Totally, totally. Yeah. So that was some of what was up with my week. You had a very different last 2 weeks. You had some time away and now you're back. So what have you been seeing or doing with your brain
Yeah,
kind of?
it was interesting. So I was traveling. I was down in Central America for a quick trip and through in Guatemala and Belize. And I always am interested in education systems. I think I learned that in Guatemala, the language obviously is Spanish there, and then Mayan is taught in a number of schools, especially in the northern and eastern part of the state where we were. And then over in Belize, the language taught is English because it was, at least for some period of time, an English colony and an English controlled country. But then they have a variety of languages, Spanish and some more Mayan and various dialects of that, and then more
Mm.
coastal languages and dialects as well. So I was just thinking about schools and languages and over the last week as I was traveling. One of the things that struck me this week is we've been talking a lot about learning spaces and out of school. We have an out of school time town hall coming up, and a couple things came across my feed and emails of spaces where we're experimenting with learning. And of course, we've been talking a lot about micros, and micro schools are different options for learning. And we've always had science centers and performing centers and art centers, things like that are out of school. But there's some interesting things that came across. So one was Wichita Learning Lab in Kansas. And this is it's a co-work space for education. So people can come with their homeschool or their micro school and actually co-locate in a space that's specifically designed for education. So I
Hmm.
hadn't quite seen that concept yet. And that might help some of these private micros who struggle with facilities. But more importantly, for me, it made me think about, I wonder if public systems can have co-located or co-education spaces like this, where multiple schools come together to do single things that are still part of the public sector. And this connected me then to we had a blog on Fab Newport that came across Getting Smart this week. And Fab Newport is a great organization in Newport, Rhode Island. That's a community learning center. And certainly listeners should read about it, but it's about how do you increase STEM and how do you increase internships. And they're doing a lot of the things that might happen in a public school, but they're in partnership with a public school and in partnership with mentors in the community. And then that led me to another blog that we had in Getting Smart, which was A School Without Walls in New York City, which again is playing with this idea of what is the space of learning. And this isn't new, but it's fun to see these newer iterations start to emerge. And then these newer iterations then combine with what does it mean to get real world experience? What does it mean for work-based learning, et cetera? So I've been thinking a lot about learning spaces this last couple of weeks.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. As growing up with a dad in K-12 architecture, I definitely thought a lot about learning spaces too. And there's also, I did a session yesterday at the ACTE conference with Adam Kulas from Tacoma. And Tacoma has some of these really cool city as classroom learning spaces between Sammy and Soda and IDEA and all these campuses that are sort of embedded within the city themselves. And students have to kind of go over there in a way that feels different. The sidewalk is your hallway rather than a hallway. So definitely a great topic for right now. And as we're thinking about these expansive education themes.
Right. And I love in that situation where, one of the schools is co-located at the zoo, right? They're right on the shore, the coast right there. So they have a underwater robotics program that is working on real world problems. Some of their students are doing internships to do some of the facilitation at the zoo and to take younger students around from the local public schools. And this is a public school and it's co-located in a zoo. And so these are really creative solutions to learning spaces that I think at Getting Smart, we appreciate and wish there was probably more of those in communities. A couple of things that jumped out at me this week is just, I know Bib Hubbard over at Learning Heroes, and Learning Heroes actually they do a lot of surveys and data work, but there was something that came across my feed that reminded me of a survey they did with Gallup around, and it was connected to NAEP scores because NAEP scores just came out and everyone's wringing their hands and saying, what do we do? We haven't made much change and we have the COVID drop. But even before that, things were just not a lot of students are demonstrating proficiency. And we talked last time about maybe they're not performing their best on the assessment. Maybe there's different ways to do assessment. But regardless, the data point here in this survey was around when they survey parents, 90% of parents believe that their child is on grade level. And that's pretty profound. So 90% believe their kids are on grade level. But when you look at assessments, only about 30% are showing proficiency. And so there's this disconnect in communication. And I'm not sure I'm not going to put blame anywhere. I just think this idea of transparency and authentic conversations and how do we all work in a student's best interest? How do we take multiple data sources and put them together? It just was something interesting that sparked in my brain.
Yeah, that's stark. It brings me back to what I was saying earlier about the missing information versus misinformation piece, right? Like how much of this is actually a delayed delivery of data and how much of this is just truly sort of this like best intentions assumption about something given your own daily interfaces with your kid, right? Like I think that could be a constructed belief off of something that's less sinister than systems not working fast enough or something like that, even though we definitely need that. We should be advocating for fast delivery of data and authentic or accurate delivery as well.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we advocate for and what a lot of our organizations that are in our sort of sphere of sort of innovation is this idea of how can we be better at telling the story of student proficiency. And the Carnegie system with letter grades and courses just doesn't work. And in this case, even with that, it's still not working. And so there's a disconnect. And I think the conclusion of the Learning Heroes Gallup poll was really about parent and school interface and what does that look like. And we're getting all this churn and conversation about parents' rights and all that kind of stuff. But really what I think we need to be focused on is not about anybody's rights. It's about the partnership that we're all in this together to help our children and or the students that we teach learn. And I'm not sure we set up that system well. It can be more adversarial than it can be in a partnership. So things to think about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, I had one more just that because we got that email. Fan mail. We loved it. It was our first fan mail. So we should celebrate, but based on the episode, our first released episode a couple weeks ago. And it was in reaction to this idea of how do you assess at the learning experience level rather than at the course level, right? Or
Right.
really granular and specific. And we gave some examples. And this particular school leader came and said, well, great. We have all the systems set up for that, meaning that the policy allowed for it, the school allowed for it. A student can do an out of school experience, and that could be given credit in some way. And we sort of asked the question about demand. And she said, well, not many students are taking advantage of it yet. That's our next big goal, is how do we make that happen? We want to see examples of that actually manifesting itself. So it did make me think a lot. You talk a lot about the sort of the demand and supply side. And it is interesting to think that even when we supply it, which we work with a lot of schools at Getting Smart, that we're helping them create the supply,
Totally.
you have to think about that demand side. So I don't know how you reacted to that conversation, but it struck me as something really important.
Yeah, I think starting younger with those helps, because I think a lot of times by high school, students have just kind of gotten into this mode of, I'm going to just get through school and not really do too many of these extras, or they're like, I don't know if I actually have autonomy when I try to make a decision. So it's like, how can we create these environments or these cultures of schools where students really feel like they're given space to run, their passions are recognized as like relevant to both them and the school community? Similar to how your first thing was, the Learning Heroes survey was about this, the interfacing between schools and parents. This one to me was like that interface between schools and students, and it's how are you communicating these options and creating a culture that actually makes them authentically believe that they can have a valuable experience out of them rather than just adding something on.
Yeah, my own lived experience, my own two children went to a very innovative school, sort of pre-K through 8, and then moved to a more traditional model after that. And I think my observation is that the demand side, it's really interesting. They adapted very quickly to a model that was much more Carnegie based and grade oriented,
Mm,
even though they were in a place that was very learner centered before. And
interesting.
so I also wonder if value needs to be created externally.
Yeah.
So it might be around how do we document learning experiences, and those have value in applying for jobs or getting into higher ed. So I'm wondering about internally motivated. You're talking about internally motivation and around value, but I also wonder how much external value we need to start thinking about, is how can we push local communities, regional organizations to say there is a value for getting data like this and doing experiences like this, and there'd be an advantage for you to do that.
Yeah, not to keep going on this point for too long, but this just brought something to mind. Probably 5 months ago, the YouTuber Mr. Beast put out his manifesto, and it's a really interesting document of how one of the most successful Gen Z business owners does it. And he has this really interesting piece in there where he says, we're not trying to make any of the best videos. We are exclusively trying to make the best YouTube video. And then it goes on to talk about all of the outcomes of a YouTube video. And it's like, they need to get to second 31 rather than second 30 on this video. So we need to do everything we can to get them up that 1 second. So I like this external value validation thing. It's like, if the school system you're in has outputs that are different, like if they're more Carnegie unit based, it's going to be really hard to convince somebody to work toward a different set of outcomes, which is maybe like value or growth. So how can you be transparent about your outcomes and make those outcomes innovative to match this experience that you're providing? And the leader that sent us stuff, I think that they're well on their way to doing that. It sounds like they're doing a lot of this outcomes revision work, which is great. But I do think that's had to be done probably in parallel, or that has to be the foundation that's set to really make a demand side grow.
Right. And fundamentally, what I want to see is every young person in the US saying, I want something different or
Totally.
has values, something that is more relevant to me
Yeah.
rather than not relevant to me, and something that has purpose to help me succeed in life. And that's not to say, I want to put a caveat out there, is for anyone who's sort of naysaying this and pushing back, is there are things we have to learn that we may not like. I don't think everything has to be learner centered. I don't think you only should personally, I don't think you should only study the things you like, because there are things out there that you may not like at first, but are really important. And
Yeah.
so I have my balance as well, but I do think we need to keep thinking about value on this conversation.
And most innovation happens at the intersection of two things, usually one thing that you really like and one thing that you're trying to interpret through the lens of the thing that you really like. So
Uh,
if you get rid of that other one, there may be less innovation. So
and the most
continue.
innovative people often think way outside their discipline. I was
Totally.
thinking, there was something, I was listening to a podcast the other day where really brilliant, innovative people always had hobbies that were musical or artistic in some way, or some other thing that they were doing that was separate from what their research was or their innovation was, but somehow freed up brain space in interesting
Yeah.
ways. So,
I think
All
Stephen
right.
King says that about writing. Writers should never major in English. They should major in something else and apply English to it. So that's great. Let's move on to the news kind of section
Yeah,
today.
let's.
I kind of have a theme that stitched a few different things together. This is sort of a rapid resource lightning round. I'll let the audience dig in and really derive more value for themselves from it. But I saw a few things this week that really touch on this idea of readiness and return on investment at a time where we are seeing R&D and lots of things struggling to get funding. So I was like, these are really important. I'm going to talk about them, think about them. One was from the org Excel and Ed, and it was about it was a pathways ROI analysis. We've been talking about pathways for years, and really thinking about what takes a pathway from a pathway to in our terms, a new pathway, right? Something that's really imbuing value into the experience. And they had a pretty simple but useful framework for evaluating some of this. I'd highly recommend digging in there and seeing a few other states that have actually implemented some of these ROI analysis programs at a state level so they can evaluate if their CTE primarily is effective. But it's just this idea that you go through and you check out what CTE programs you're offering. You see how they align to the K-12 and post-secondary programs. You see how they align to I think it's like high satisfaction, high wages, and high growth occupations. They're calling this H3. To us, that means something different. But so, how are your CTE programs aligning to workforce needs, especially in your community? And they do all of them include opportunities for college credit, work-based learning, and industry credentials. So I think that like we advocate for this thing that's even bigger than this. It's about including other experiences. It's including other places to build skills. But I think that's a pretty useful iterative framework to just keep doing every year where you're like, are we offering enough of these that every kid can access them? Are they all connected to high value occupations? And is a student that's in this pathway going to be able to get all of these different things that are kind of more proven to generate success?
Yeah,
So,
no, interesting. I think that's right on. I think that those types of questions are critical. I feel that across the country, every school, public school, has to have some sort of CTE type program at the high school. So it's they're there, and often they are just you complete 2 courses in a single sector, and you have stamped that you're a CTE
totally.
you've completed a CTE pathway. And I think this is just indicating, it's like, how do we do more than that, and how do we push? And it's much easier just to offer 2 courses than it is to offer 2 courses and make sure there's an IRC or there's a college credit associated or a real work-based learning, real world experience associated with it. So how do we up the ante? And that goes back to maybe the demand side of the equation, is making sure students are saying, hey, I want experience. 2 courses are great. If I can take 2 courses in whatever sector I'm interested in, but I need to go do an internship or an apprenticeship. And how
Yep.
can you as a school help facilitate that and give me credit for it? So right on. What's your next
Totally.
one?
The next one, when I was at Cozen, they were talking about this guide that I must have just missed called the Gen AI Maturity Guide. And it's a really good resource for doing internal audits of your organization to see basically if you're ready and in what places you're ready to adopt AI better into your workflow and as something to grapple with. So they broke it into 7 sections, basically executive leadership readiness, ops readiness, data readiness, technical readiness, security readiness, legal risk readiness, and academic AI literacy readiness. And I think it was a really useful tool to a lot of people in the room for being able to see themselves in it, plot themselves at varying points. Nobody's finger wagging at you while you're doing it, but it's just a really good place to say, hey, we've made some steps in AI, but we know there's going to be some room for growth. Let's see where we can grow. So as districts are grappling with this, highly recommend going to cozen.org/AI. You can find it there, and it's a really useful tool.
And does it have like a progression, or is it a yes,
Yeah.
no for each one of these? Yeah.
Progression
Yeah.
for each one. Yep. So
Yeah. Love it.
yeah, super helpful. And then the last one is just this ongoing conversation that everyone at Getting Smart is having, but you and I as well, on knowledge and durable skills. I saw a recent report from America Succeeds come out that studied a couple of great schools, Gibson Eck, Caps Monette, Building 21, and Bostonia Global. And they're really doing the work of evaluating valuable experiences and then saying, what is it that made these valuable? I think that they are a little bit on the side of, hey, we're not going to just assume that these things are valuable experiences. We want to know from the learners through tons of research and interviews what actually made them valuable, even if it's just getting us back to our place of assumption, right? Like, so they've gone through these first 4 schools, done their first round of interviews, or like a handful of interviews at each school. And they've derived that interest-driven learning, project-based learning, real-world engagement, competency-based learning and assessment, and intentional advising practices are really the 5 things that set out an experience. I think 4 of those would have been on my list. And then advising, I think if I would have thought long enough, I would have come up with, but I was really glad to see that was on there. I think that's a often overlooked part of a valuable experience is that advisor role. So I was really glad that showed up, but great report. We'll link it in the show notes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Mason, was interesting reading that report. So really respect what America Succeeds is doing, and Tim Taylor and his team are awesome. And I love their process of taking a lot of job descriptions, and then that's how they built their set of competencies. So great work there, and the report's great. And one of the things I noted was that in the report is they're starting from the place of competency in their portrait, whatever they don't call it a portrait, but
right.
their competency work. And then they're saying, what are the best ways to teach that? And it comes out as interest-driven learning, project-based learning, et cetera. So the part of that research that was interesting is they're saying, hey, we've got these things we want to teach that we think are showing up in job descriptions and are valuable. The best way to teach them is interest-driven learning, project-based learning, real-world engagement. So I think that's important. And I appreciate their research that are just reaffirming that we know that there are gaps in these competencies in young people and those that are already professionals. And here are the types of learning experiences that will help develop them, right? And so I think that's
Totally.
really, and it verifies what we've been thinking about, and appreciate the advising piece as well, because it helps guide people into what might you do to develop these particular areas.
Totally. It makes younger me very happy because back in the day, everybody was like, oh, you're creative. I'm sure Google will just hire you. Because Google was like the first to kind of raise the alarm. It was like, we want creative people. And so now they're looking at these skills and they're like, how can we make these a little bit more something we actually teach people and measure? Because otherwise it's pretty hard to just prove you're a creative person.
The other thing I'm curious about here, and we've had a little bit of a conversation, but I'm having it's not a midlife crisis. It's just a revelation of the pendulum swinging.
It's okay if it is.
Yeah, it's okay. It's a older life crisis, maybe, because
Okay.
I'm already in my mid 50s. So, but this idea of pendulum swinging, and I'm noticing, there's this huge push for competencies and portraits of graduates and the things that we know are really important. And I want to make sure that they're not grounded in emptiness. And so this
Yeah.
idea of remembering that knowledge is also important. It's really hard to do interest-driven learning if there's no knowledge that you can actually drive through. Or project-based learning can be, someone described as Swiss cheese projects. They're really engaging. I love it. I'm doing this incredible stuff, but you don't actually learn anything because there's no accountability for the knowledge side of the equation. So fundamentally, we have to know something to be able to do well in these projects, to be able to demonstrate these competencies that are showing up in portraits of graduates. What do you think? Do you make sense?
I totally agree with everything you just said, except for the fact that you might be past your midlife crisis. If anyone is going to live to 110, it is Nate McClennen. You remind me very much of Rob Lowe in Parks and Rec when he's like, scientists say that the first man who lives to 120 is already born. I believe I am that person. So everything else, full agreement. Yep.
Yeah. All right. I've got another one for you, looking abroad a little bit. We've been diving so much into micro-credentials, and you and I have been we've been diving into metadata and trying to understand standards. And neither you nor I are sort of technical, but we're not working on the back end. We're on the front end. We're trying to understand and talk to our audiences about what's happening in education. And then we work with programs and schools that are trying to make a difference and trying to redesign and design interesting learning models. So, but we do desperately try to understand, and you and I slack often about, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? And we've been talking about metadata associated with, if we wanted to credential experiences for young people in high school, what kind of metadata would have to be associated with it? So all these really nuanced technical things. So
Yep.
I got caught up in some sort of web search and stumbled on New Zealand, which it's always good to look outside the United States and see what's going on. And it is
Always.
really interesting what they've done there. Two things. So they have, like many countries in the world that are not state oriented like the United States, it's a nationally controlled system. So that, number one, is a opportunity that the United States will never have. We're always going to be a 50 state type situation, which makes it more challenging in all sorts of ways. But this idea of that they have a New Zealand Qualifications Authority, which is their documentation of all things that a student has learned. So think about the work we've done on learning and employment records. They have something called the New Zealand Record of Achievement that documents everything from at least ninth grade, high school, all the way through tertiary or post-secondary into, your adult upskilling life. So the system it's a common transcript system, starts in secondary school. And when you look at a transcript, the transcript is a competency-based transcript. And I think about The schools, number of schools we've worked with in the United States are like, hey, we should do a competency-based transcript. But there's not a whole lot of examples in the United States of the schools doing this. And then you go to New
Yeah.
Zealand and everything is a competency-based transcript. If you click on the link that I shared, we'll put it in the show notes. It says science and it has here the competencies, and you have a grade on each one of the competencies or some sort of proficiency on each one of those competencies. It truly describes the skills. And even more, they have a micro-credentialing system that's connected to careers that is standardized across all industries and the entire country. And those also show up on the New Zealand record of achievement. So I think that as states, because states are going to have more and more authority as the Fed, at least in the short term, is going to shrink in its influence, states ought to look at some of these other countries that have done it. New Zealand is not a very big country. Right? It could be easily, that system could be matched in any one of the states in the United States. So it's just interesting and a reminder for us to look broader than the United States.
Totally. Super, super good point. And I think you and I were sparring on this idea a little bit earlier this week, but if you click into it, what you were saying about the micro-credentialing for hiring, like it is a credential that will extend for your whole life. So they really have this, it doesn't feel like it's quite an LER yet, but it does feel like it's a proficiency at certain things. And it gets up to level 10, I believe. And you can go like 1, 2, 3. And I think they said 3 is roughly where secondary ends. So everything above 3 is just building expertise. It's building this knowledge piece that's so important to supplement these durable skills. And just a really articulate example of how we can better showcase what we know and are able to do.
Yeah. And it's not, learning an employment record, anything is a learning and employment record, right? Like transcript right now, it could be a learning and employment record. But they don't have I think what you're saying is they don't have a true digital wallet set up right now. It's not self-sovereign. It's not set up in that way, the things we've been talking about, because you still have to go into the New Zealand Qualifications Authority and request to access and request to send, et cetera. Still centralized control. But I could see the pivot of moving to an LER and a digital wallet and self-sovereignty and things like that. So,
all right. So hear me out. While we're still lightly global, last week, after our last catching up, I was asked to come talk to a small group of folks about abundance, and we're chatting about it. And I'm still kind of working on the pitch, I guess, of how this really connects to education. I don't think a lot of people are using that language, so it was a great experience. And naturally, like we kind of gestured at this in the last time we talked about it, but people were sort of taking umbrage with the ESA approach. They were worried about it taking a little bit too much money out of the pool. And on the podcast, you had mentioned the Florida school that we learned about from Michael Horn's show that has begun bundling these, or I guess unbundling these a la carte experiences back to students who have taken ESA dollars. So a homeschool student could take a class from the high school or something like that, or use facilities. So when I was doing this talk, like the thing that came to me was all of these lifelong learning initiatives that I've seen around the world, where I'm like, really, an abundance framework fundamentally is schools changing who they serve. And suddenly they are serving the entire community, not just freshmen through 12th grade at a high school or whatever. So just a couple of examples, and I would love to know what you think about this because I'm still kind of workshopping it. But there's pushes for 529 plans, which is like the college savings account, to be able to be applied to a bunch of new programs. There is data that shows that 25% of online college enrollments are actually paid for by employers. So that's like Amazon, your employer, paying for you to enroll somewhere to reskill or upskill. In Singapore, they rolled out a reskilling allowance. So everybody, I think they actually made it 30. It started at 40, but now it's everybody over the age of 30 who wants to reskill gets a monthly allowance for reskilling. So from the state or the city, they're getting this reskilling allowance. And I was just doing some more research. In Sweden and France, they have different versions of this as well, where you get an accruable account of training credit. In Korea, they've had a lifelong education promotion plan since 2002, which includes a voucher system and national Tomorrow Learning Card. So I'm thinking like an abundance framework really means rethinking funding streams at such a grand scale and who schools serve, that maybe you're an adult and you're wanting to go either change your degree or just enroll in something. And you think about your local high school who has a skills center and has this kind of thing, and you can go and actually purchase training from them, which then adds money into the school system again. And it's not a student, but suddenly your student body has gone up by so much if you start thinking about it that way. And that, to me, is a really good example of shifting from a scarcity to an abundance mindset in a pretty tangible way. But I'm super curious. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in some ways higher ed has done this already, right? Because they offer non-degree, non-credit courses. Anybody can take them. And so they're a good example of a university, especially if they have an online component, which almost every university does now,
Right.
has turned into a learning center, cradle to grave, right? So, but K-12 is not like that at all. So
Right.
I think you present an interesting argument that can schools expand to be upskilling for more diverse members of the community, like not just your K-12 students. And so I think it's a really interesting piece. And maybe, just maybe, if we go back to the abundance piece, which I think is your hypothesis here, is that ESAs are challenging to a number in the public sector for sure. And I understand why. But if they cause the public sector or the public district to open up its walls for more interesting opportunities to bring funding back in, maybe that's the start of this idea of a learning center instead of a high school. Yeah.
Well, it goes back to your learning spaces conversation from earlier. And I think you're absolutely right that higher ed has paved this way. But I'd actually be really interested to see a radius map of where physical colleges are and where the like gaps are and where the K-12 schools are in comparison. Because I do think colleges will probably win at an online offering level. I think that's just going to be a space where they have a little bit more maybe authority or something. But I think that the physical asset of the school building and the things that are in them are really useful spaces for cultivating this kind of reskilling. So I don't know, just something I was messing with this week and was pleased to see that the actual funding stream solution has been kind of at least addressed in a number of places around the world. And then it's just a matter of opening your walls. So
right. And it does, I mean, it is a fundamental shift. And this is what's hard for, I think, a lot of people in education is that it is a fundamental shift to sort of a market economy for education because you're suddenly operating a bit more that you offer a lot of programs and there's other people that offer programs and how are we competing? And, competition personally, I think competition helps. I think it does up the ante. In our area, we have a lot of competition and that's increased the quality for all sorts of students. I think that's important. I think obviously access is a really important piece and thus the public sector is so important. It does make me think a little bit about Roscoe Unified down in Texas, because Texas actually has some great laws to allow for early college and allow for high schools to offer that. And so Roscoe is part of a collegiate education. This is a larger network of rural schools. They allow students to stay 1 to 2 years after your graduation, but in the building to complete their associate's degree. Or if they've already completed their associate's degree through grade 12, they can stay for 13 and 14 and get a bachelor's degree without leaving their hometown, which sometimes, especially in rural spaces, is a challenge because of people don't want to leave or they have commitments to family or to ranching or farming or whatever the case may be. So this idea of being able to offer a broader and more expansive view of education to help people get what they need and the upskilling they need directly in place through a learning center, usually used to be called a school, is it really interesting?
yeah, no, I think that's really interesting as well.
Yeah.
Well, I'm writing a blog on it right now to see if I can make my thoughts make more sense, but would love to keep riffing on that because I think it's an interesting abundance frame.
And there's probably, I bet you if we looked around and maybe listeners can send us a note if you hear this, but I bet you there's more examples than we know of especially in the urban sector and maybe in the rural sector of schools serving as community learning spaces. And I know that there's districts that do parent upskilling and they offer parents courses and classes in their buildings just as much as they offer students. And so I think it tends to be school day isolated, that happens in the evening and the students are in the school
right.
day. So let's keep looking and maybe we'll find some other interesting examples we can
Yeah,
share.
would love more of those.
So my last news item for this session is you and I are both Ethan Malik fans and he's writing extensively on AI. So I really love his blog, One Useful Thing. And he just did a study as part of his work at Wharton at Penn. And the study did this. They basically took a bunch of employees of a company and they gave them a project to work on and they determined a set of outcomes that would measure the quality of their outcomes. So they had a quality measure that was verified and similar across their different groups. And they did 3 different treatments. So they had individuals that had access to AI, ChatGPT or Claude or something like that. They had a team of individuals that didn't have access to AI. And then they had a team that was assisted by AI. So the team was able to use AI, and they all completed the same type of project, were all measured in the same outcomes. Really cool study. Here's the conclusions in a nutshell. So the AI assisted individuals, their output or their outcomes were the same as the non-AI use teams, which is
Wow.
really interesting, right? So just if I'm an individual and I can use AI as a thought partner and use it effectively, my outcomes were the equal to a team of humans that didn't have access to AI.
Hmm.
However, when they gave AI to the team, the outcomes are even higher than those other two, the AI assisted individuals and non-AI teams. So the AI assistants, and the reason, the descriptions of why was so things were more efficient in the AI assisted teams, especially when the project was cross-discipline. Expertise boundaries vanished. So if you were a group of, say, folks that were just focused on biology, and your project needed more than that, the expertise you could get from your AI assist. And so it
Hmm.
added for better outcomes that way. And then the last conclusion, which I thought was really interesting, is there was an increase in positive emotions with AI support, which is a little bit contrary to some of the other research we're seeing. So, but they felt like it was an easier project to complete. They felt like more positive about the experience. And so perhaps this is an indication of how do we use AI well. And it's not a replacement for humans, but it's an enhancement for humans. And especially when we have, going back to the very beginning, what we were talking about, Mason, was this idea of it's hard to keep up with everything. And we all have gaps in our knowledge. And if you can add an AI which has access to a huge amount of knowledge that no one individual could ever learn, is that fills some of those puzzle pieces to make a better product in the end. So I think it's worth reading. He writes really well and can summarize it really well. But this idea of democratizing expertise, enabling more employees to contribute meaningfully, like really interesting conclusions. And so certainly just one study, but it made me think about schools and how we use AI in schools, and how are we teaching students to collaborate with AI in interesting ways, and how are we teaching students to collaborate with each other and with AI, which I don't think is happening very much. And so we need to continue to think about what's uniquely human.
For sure. Well, that brings us very neatly into our landing zone. So we're going to do our quick What's Human section. I've got a couple. So we did a podcast with Isabel Howe about her new book on early learning and AI. And it was super interesting. But she and I kept riffing after the conversation about this idea of AI readiness, kind of similar to my earlier themes. And it just brought this story to mind that I've heard a bunch of times from people like Cal Newport and Kevin Kelly and these authors, but they always use the Amish as a really interesting adoption story for technology. Because if you look at the Amish, the knee jerk is to say that they actually don't accept technology, right? Like they live a life sort of free of technology after a certain point, because you could make the case that like a lot of things are technology, like a wheel.
Yeah, right.
But they have these really harsh lines from the outside, but when you actually talk with them, what they say is they adopt technology that strengthens their culture and their community values. So you'll see people there that have rollerblades, that have solar panels, that have some things that you're like, oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that they did this. But the reason they would go for rollerblades rather than a bike is because a bike takes people way too far from the community, and they want to stay close
Oh,
together. They don't take these other phones because it widens that circle of community and cultural values. And I think that there's something too that's really interesting, because at these conferences and everywhere, I've almost like started doing a little bit of a drinking game with myself. Whenever anybody says start with why, it is usually used in this kind of way where it's like just a passing tone. You're just like, oh, I'm going to say this and then move on. But this is a really interesting example for me of starting with why when you're adopting technology, when you're bringing anything into your school culture, even what is it going to do to our culture, and how can we make sure that it is positive and supportive of our end vision? So I don't know, it kind of was rattling around in my brain, but this piece about humans and being able to really dial that in jumped out at me this week. What do you think about that?
yeah, no, it makes sense. I hadn't really thought about that Amish analogy, and that this idea of adopting for a purpose. So you use it, but it doesn't break your mantra of, hey, we want to keep our community together. Solar blades, our solar panels and the roller blades.
Solar
Yeah,
blades.
solar blades.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what that is. Solar blades.
That sounds good and dangerous.
When we were traveling last week, is while going to these places is amazing, it is meeting people that's the most interesting part. And even
Yeah.
just the taxi drivers or the shuttle drivers, and just interacting with humans who are different from you, who you don't know, and what you can learn from them and what they learn from you. And when we went into Guatemala, we flew into the airport, took a Uber over to Guatemala City, and which is about, I don't know, it's about a 20-minute ride. And by the end, we had figured out a great restaurant to go to that we never would have gone to. It was on the rooftop of this random building. And he said, here's the address. Here's where you should go. It's really awesome. And we never would have experienced that. So it goes back to relationship. And no matter how much AI is going to replicate relationships, it is going to be really difficult to sort of replicate that human to human interaction when you're moving around geographically in a space, in your community, in your world, interacting with your neighbor, interacting with someone in Guatemala, whatever the case may be. So I'm still a firm believer that that's going to keep us human.
I totally agree. And I think that solar blades might actually be the winged sandals that Hermes, the Greek god, wears. I think that seems right. And I've wanted those ever since I saw Hercules when I was about 3. So if anybody's listening is really good at design and machines, would love some solar blades.
All right. So our takeaway from this entire podcast is that you should go and create or find solar blades. And if you do, let us know where they are, and we'll do a quick description on our next podcast.
And I'm sure you're going to need an AI team to do it. So be sure to bring them in.
Definitely, I'm going to need an AI team to do it for sure.
Amazing. Well, thanks, Nate. Always great catching up. Glad to have you back.
Yeah, great to catch up, Mason. We'll see you next time. I'm nervous about guessing.
You're gonna do great. All right. Here we go.
The world's turning faster. I can feel it in my bones. 1,000 voices crying through my telephone. The headlines hit like hammers. They don't give me room to breathe. It's a race I'm running, Lord, but I'm tangled in the weeds. The kids talk in a language I don't understand. Their fingers fly like sparrows, a device in every hand. The music don't sound the way it used to in my day. Sometimes I want to holler, can we just hit replay? I'm catching up, but I'm falling behind. This road is long and these hills sure ain't kind. Every step forward feels like 2 steps back. I'm catching up, but I'm losing the track.
I love it. I love it. Okay. So first, I think it's definitely some bluesy folk going on there. So that's my genre. Definitely some blues chords. I don't know. I mean, I just saw the Bob Dylan movie. It's definitely not Bob Dylan's voice, but the lyrics remind me of that. Maybe a John Lee Hooker influence. I don't know. Taj Mahal. What was your influence?
Those are very close. That's great. So I prompted it and said, give me a country blues in the style of Johnny Cash on the theme of catching up. And so it gave me that song, and I prompted it twice to say, go lower. And that was, I guess, the lowest the voice could get.
Yeah, but, outstanding. Well, Johnny Cash was in the Bob Dylan movie. So there
that's true. Go. He was. There you go. That you basically were right. So that is
right.
I listened to that chorus and I was like, that chorus is almost good enough to just be the theme song for this. Like the I'm catching up.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so good. I think that could be our intro, maybe moving forward.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social